Thank you for coming to Recipe for Capital Projects. The session today is worth 1.5 CAI continuing education credits. You must be scanned in to receive credits. I know some of you came in early. I'm not sure if all of you got scanned. If you did not, you can get scanned on the way out. Evaluation of CE certificates will be sent via email after the show. We are interested in your feedback as it helps us plan for next year. For the continuing education certificates, please print them and keep them for your records. If you do not receive this email, contact the CAI office, because after 30 days, certificate reprints will carry a $25 processing fee. You may also stop by registration on your way out and print the certificate, which lists all the classes you attended and the credits you earned. A couple of reminders. If you haven't already, please download the mobile app. The mobile app contains everything about the show, from the schedule, layout of the exhibit hall, and the program handouts. Right after this session, the keynote speaker will be in this room, but you must get rescanned to receive the credits. CAI shall be entitled to use any photographs, recordings, and other likenesses of this event, or any attendees or participants at the event, in any advertisement, promotion, or reproduction of the event in any manner. Said images are for the sole use of CAI, its members, and chapter, and any content or images from this program, including written and recorded materials, may not be used in the court of law or other purposes not authorized by CAI. Now, we're able to have this event because of some of our great sponsors we have. This session is sponsored by Landscape Concepts Management. We have Jesse Bosman, who's going to say a couple words here before we get started.
Hi everybody, I'm Jesse Bosman. I'm being blinded. I'm the new Vice President of Sales at Landscape Concepts Management. Thank you all for coming. You guys are in very good hands. You have Gabriella, you have Michelle, and then you have Mark. This should be very educational for you. This is a little bit of commercial about my company. We have our company. We have offices in Wisconsin. We have offices in Grayslake, Aurora, and Chicago. We service from Sheboygan, Wisconsin, all the way down to Joliet, all the way out to Madison. Full service, one-stop shop company. We have certified arborists, certified landscape technicians, certified irrigation technicians, design build, certified designers, landscape architects, all on staff, no subcontractors. Thank you everybody, and enjoy the session.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, so I'm going to be walking around so you guys can ask questions as we go, and the panel up here might be asking some questions of you guys, so hopefully you guys are awake, had your coffee, and will participate. Your speakers today are Gabby Comstock. She is an attorney at Keough & Moody. Michelle Trina is the Director of Suburban Management at Lieberman Management Services, and Mark Waldman, who's President of Waldman Engineering. I'll turn it over to Michelle, and she's going to get started here.
Thank you, Mike. All right, can everyone hear? Okay. So thank you, everyone. As Mike said, I am going to have him asking some questions. We don't want to do all the talking, and encourage participation as well. And you can follow along. I don't know how many people downloaded the handout to take notes. It is available on the mobile app, and you can always print it out later as well. So one of the things we want to talk about today is capital projects. We have this presentation scheduled around managers from 0 to 5 years. So some of it may be remedial, some of it may be new for some of you. Feel free to ask questions at any time and direct it to any of us here today. So let's start off by talking about some of these items. What are the ingredients that are needed? We're going to talk about how to put together a great team, some of the communication, quality communication, well-defined, detailed projects, all the steps that you have to do start to finish, as well as how to put together and make sure everything's included in a detailed contract. And like any good recipe, whether you're baking at home or doing a project outside of the office, we need to have the right people in place and quality leads to make it a success. So with that being said, we need to decide what type of project we're doing, whether it's a roofing, siding, balcony. Are we going to make a stew? Are we going to make a steak? Are there multiple elements or just one involved? So the first question I have for everyone, how many people here have handled a capital project from start to finish? So that's probably at least 50%, so that's good. How many people have that, just raise your hand, had a project that went smooth from start to finish?
Oh, come on.
Well, I give you props for those people that had that happen. You obviously did a great job.
I think we were involved in that.
Yeah, I think
I'm pretty sure the team involved here, yes, along with probably yourself, made it a success. No matter how well you plan, there's always going to be some sort of a glitch in the system, but we're going to try and cover as many of those items to make it as smooth as possible, whether it's communicating with your board, talking with your homeowners, putting together the specifications. And Gabby, I think you wanted to add a couple of things here about the project and what we need to know before we start the project.
Well, and I think that Michelle is right. There's so much that goes into it early on. And in my opinion, this first part that she's going to be describing, this is probably one of the more critical points for everybody involved. And this is probably where I see, unfortunately, too many people, especially board members, wanting to take a step back and not wanting to be a part of this. And when you're not active at the forefront, as we talk later about some of the issues that can come up, I think a lot of those issues could have been avoided if they were discussed. You know, I'm sorry for the group over here. I feel like you can't even see me. If these issues were discussed early on and planned for, as we go through the process today, I think you'll see that it would have avoided problems at the end. So this, in my opinion, from the attorney's perspective, is one of the most important steps where there has to be a lot of communication early on from everybody involved.
Thank you, Gabby. So regardless of the capital project, the main ingredients are going to be the same throughout. So we are going to go step by step. We're going to talk about how to start the process, defining the full scope of the process and the project, selecting the vendors, how to put your team together, determine how you're going to pay for it, how are you going to get the funds, how to go over the written agreements and what agreement should be included, implement and live out the whole project. So one of the things is defining the cause of the project. So as you know, whenever you're doing a property inspection, looking at items, doing your budget, everyone always tries to budget for all the repairs. And it looks like, for example, if you're doing a balcony or a roofing project, you find out that you're setting aside so much money every year to make these repairs. So who here can tell me what's the usual threshold for what percentage of the repairs you should be doing annually before you consider doing it a capital project? And Mike's going to get us an answer somehow. So let's say a roof replacement project. At what point, even if your reserve study says it's not due for 2 more years, because we know the reserve studies are never exact, all the roofs don't start falling off on the exact date that's listed in the reserve study, what percentage should you be spending annually or not exceed annually before you should start considering maybe a total replacement as opposed to just maintenance and repairs?
Anybody.
Anybody.
Guess. There's no wrong answer.
20%? Okay, any other guesses? 10%? Anyone else?
It's not that simple.
Well, no, there's no exact number, but there's a balance. Anyone else? So we have 10 and 20? 30%. 30%? Mark Waldman, what is the answer usually?
Why? Yeah, it is dependent upon the element, but as a general rule, if you're spending more than 10% of the cost of a replacement for an element that's got less than a 10-year useful life, you're going to be wasting money doing that repair. So it is element dependent, but that's probably the threshold number if you need a rule of thumb.
Thank you. So as Mark said,
There is no wrong answer, though.
correct, there is no wrong answer, but that's a good starting point from there. So then we go on to, was a project initiated as a result of the reserve study? So it could be due to the fact we're doing this reserve project because that's what's outlined in the reserve study. Is the problem because of maybe a code violation, a facade issue, and the level of immediacy? So what's an example of something where you must initiate a capital project right away, such as a life safety issue? What kind of project would need immediate, even if you didn't budget for it? Did you, I'm sorry, porch replacement? And balcony, good answer.
Elevator.
Elevators.
Elevators, especially if there's only one in the building.
Fire equipment.
Any fire
Whenever the
sprinklers?
village puts you on notice.
Correct. We love getting those at the last minute and getting 30 days to repair those. Those are pretty common, believe it or not. All right, so when you want to start the process, it's very important that your management team have dialogue with the board. Make sure that you're inspecting the property regularly, and make sure when you're inspecting your property that you're taking notes and keeping a list and tracking any type of repairs that you're doing so that you can help the board as well as your homeowners understand what prompted to have to do a capital project. Make sure you're communicating with your experts in the field, whether it's an engineer, a roofer, an attorney, who's ever the specialist for that type of project. Review the association's reserve study. It's also important that you make sure you have your reserve study updated on a regular basis, because like I said earlier, things change. Just because it says your concrete is due for replacement on a certain year, it doesn't mean all the concrete is going to heave, except for when we have bad winters here. Or the concrete's going to start cracking, or the asphalt's going to start cracking. So it's important that you update your reserve study as well. Review recent maintenance issues. Have you, any trends? Have you gotten a lot of complaints from homeowners, from your board members? Consider the cost to repair versus replacement. What else? Okay, I'm going to go on to defining the scope of the project. Who's best to identify the scope of the project? Is it the manager? Should the board members help write that up? Should you ask homeowners and put together a committee? Does anyone have an answer? Who should identify the scope of the project? Exactly.
I think we got the best answer in the back here.
Good answer.
I would say all of the above, because there's so many different ways of looking at some of these projects. And Mark's gonna look at it differently than the manager's gonna be looking at it, than the board member's going to be, than the unit owner's going to be. So I think it's all of the above, and a combination of everybody putting, and this is what I mean, why it's so important for everybody to be active in the process, because we want to know all the different perspectives so we can put together the end result, what we really do need to accomplish.
Yeah, it might even be a vendor, a roofer, a plumber, a paving contractor. These folks who are on your property maybe doing maintenance work have found something or have input on something that you might be spending a lot of money doing maintenance on that has an underlying problem that you're not addressing by doing the maintenance, whether it's a drainage issue or a facade leak or something like that. So a vendor that's working on the property may be part of it.
And I'm sure, Michelle, you probably see so often, and other managers do as well, that you go in thinking this is what we want to take care of, and then somebody like Mark comes in and says, yes, but also this, and you may never have even contemplated it. And that's where I think it's so important to be open-minded, and not just to be strapped by your budget or what you think needs to be repaired.
And more times than not, it ends up, we have an idea of what it is when you're talking with the engineer, and we get there and you need more than one specialist there. It could involve when you're doing a balcony project, that then you also have to have someone to deal with the exterior other elements of the building, or you need someone that can deal with any HVAC systems or plumbing. So a lot of times you have multiple vendors working together at the same time. You have to coordinate all of them together. So then we go on to the manager's role in writing project specifications. How many managers here today have helped write specifications for any capital projects? Okay, that's good that you have an input and you put together basic specifications, but in my experience, and Gabby and Mark, you can help me out here, I don't recommend you being the one to do for capital projects the complete specifications. It's important to always make sure that you have some sort of engineer review it. Specifically, Mark is always willing to do that for you. Because they're the experts in that field, and we don't want managers being experts and having something overlooked. So it's good to be able to put your 2 cents in, but make sure that you are relying on your experts, because as managers, we're not experts in every field. You also want to make sure that you have board member involvement, because there's a lot of times there's board members that are retired and had some expertise in some field, and you want to make sure that they can participate and put their 2 cents in as well. Also, owner involvement. There's always going to be owner questions, and we all know there's owners out there that can also be experts in everything and put in their 2 cents.
And that's a fine line with the owner involvement. I think it's so important, to Michelle's point, to hear from the owners, but you have to remember the owner is looking at it from, this is what I want, this is what I need. Whereas as a board member, you may want it and need it, but the association, it's not in their best interest. And so they're looking at it from a very different perspective. And I think it's a fine line, because you don't want owners to feel that they are making the decision, and then at the end of the day, it's just a board decision and you didn't take any of their suggestions. So you have to really balance the expectation of that owner if you're going to ask for their input when you're putting together your project. And I think that's a very, very fine line. And it's, again, something you need to consider in advance of going to the owners and asking, what do you think needs to be done? Probably one of the best ways to get owner involvement without giving them too much of a feeling of power is a survey, where they can just let you know what they're seeing. I've seen it happen very often with water infiltration issues. You know, Mark and I have done this before, where we want to know it so that the board can define the scope. We'll go to the owners and say, where are you seeing problems? That's a great way to get them involved, because then they know you're trying to resolve the issue, versus at a meeting saying, well, what would you like to see fixed? If you do it through the survey, you're getting them to give you the information that you need and that Mark needs to put together the project, but you're also limiting their involvement to the extent of not making them feel that there is a higher expectation of their involvement in the whole project.
And throughout the whole project, you do want to make sure that you keep your owners involved, whether it's having a town hall meeting, having just a communication workshop, anything along those lines, so that they're kept informed the whole time. Otherwise, they're going to be asking questions and interrupting the project, and you don't want them going up to the engineers and the people working during the project as well. And then we're going to also go over the other factors to consider when we're defining the scope of the work. First of all, then you're going to have to start with putting your team together. Who's selecting the vendors? So in most cases, I know that the managers get to go out to bid. I usually recommend, when you're going out to bid for a project, you work with the engineer who's put together the scope, and he will set it out, but you can tell them a minimum of vendors that you want to go out to. But keep in mind, I would keep it on the higher side, 5 to 7 vendors, because usually there's always one that will decline to bid, or one that doesn't answer, and you want to make sure that you have a good selection of vendors. Where else, other than going through CAI and some of the CAI information, can you find reputable vendors?
Google.
Google's great, especially if you read the reviews. Right, reach out to some of your managers, reach out to CAI, talk to your engineer. Make sure that they're all licensed, insured. You don't want to just go with, if you're doing a whole capital project, I know I hear from time to time somebody's brother's uncle's mother's son's brother can do the work, which is fine. I encourage you to look at all avenues. However, just make sure that they meet the criteria and that you communicate that to your engineer when he goes out the bid.
And just one thing on that point. So often I hear when something goes wrong, the board says to me, well, that's somebody who management worked with a lot. And they make it seem like that's something bad. And they make it seem like, well, they must have been in cahoots. There must have been something, that's why the project didn't go that way. Or that's because the architect has a really good relationship with that contractor, and that architect was trying to take care of the contractor, not us. When you're putting together the team, be upfront to the board. And I do think you should say, these are vendors I've worked with. And this is one of the advantages of our management company, because we have experience with these vendors, and I can tell you we've had good experience. There are other vendors we've worked with who we haven't had a good experience with, and that's why we don't bring them to the table. But be upfront early on and letting them know that you have worked with them, why you're bringing them back, and I think that will help later when there may be a problem with the project, because you fully have disclosed it, and not that you have to disclose it like there's something wrong with it, but more along the lines of, This is why you have a management company, to bring you these resources. Or this is why we go with an experienced architect or engineer to bring that experience so you can benefit from it.
Yeah, let's be honest, we all have our biases and our baggage, and there are many contractors who do good work, but there are folks who specialize in doing work in this industry. We're working on people's homes, we're in their space. If you're in this organization and you've been in this organization for more than 5 years, you won't survive in here in this organization without doing a good job, because people will talk. And the contractors this is a great resource, obviously, for vendors who do the build-out work and construction work on projects here, because they are familiar with how you deal with owners and be in their space. The point I guess I'm making is there are lots of storm chasers out there doing work when we get hail damage, and that is a very scary thing because these folks do not have a reputation in this area or in this industry. So maybe that's just one limited point.
But I think to your point, Mark, and I think that's something we should also address, is don't hold your neck out for someone if you really don't know that they're going to do a good job. Just because this might be somebody that your company has worked with before, if you haven't had that firsthand experience or you haven't talked to other managers in your company about it, don't say to your board, this is a good company or this is somebody you should consider. Go do that homework for them, or put them in touch with people to get that information, because that's where it becomes very problematic for managers.
Agreed. Just make sure you're doing your due diligence and make sure you're not taking on more than you can handle. As I said earlier, as managers, you're not experts in all of these things. You're not an attorney, you're not an engineer. I know time and time again I have boards that don't want to hire an engineer. We can't be expected to know everything. It's not our job to manage all aspects of the whole capital project. So I highly encourage you to get an engineer involved and a project manager, someone else that can do the day-to-day. I can tell you whether the project's been done, but I don't know if it's being done to the correct specifications or not. So it's very important. And make sure that if you're looking for a vendor, another thing that you can do aside from asking your peers is when you're talking to some of your other vendors, ask them who they've worked with that's worked out rather well. Even if it's a landscaper, they've seen other people on projects, they talk to other managers, they can give you their advice as well, so it's not just coming from you. But you don't want to recommend somebody that you personally don't have any experience with, so make sure that you're getting good, authentic feedback from those that are recommending any type of vendor. Okay, I think I'm going to turn it over to Mark, and we're going to talk about the necessity of using an architect and engineer, and I will turn it over to him.
Thank you. Thanks, Michelle.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you all hear me okay? Why do you need to get an engineer involved? Let's be honest. I mean, we just add overhead to the project, right? I mean, isn't it just expensive to do that? How many of you had an engineer or worked with an engineer? Okay. How many of you had a good experience working with an engineer? Okay, that's encouraging. This sounds a little self-serving. I'll be honest. I'll be honest with you. This whole thing sounds a little self-serving, but why would you? Is there any time when you absolutely have to have an engineer involved? Yes.
I would say when you have a major project like roofing or balconies, anything structural.
So if you need a set of permit drawings, for example, that have to be sealed, then you would need to have an architect or an engineer involved. So I don't want to just, I mean, I think engineers are smart people, right? But we don't know everything.
They definitely think they're smart people.
Yeah. Yeah. Giant egos. It's ridiculous.
But you might also want an engineer, even if it's not the most sophisticated project, because of the dynamics within the community or the life safety issues. Don't you think, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you, probably one of the most important things, other than life safety or a code related issue, would be to help identify the scope and to give you a set of documents that will allow you to get competitive bids. We talked earlier on about where you might get information about what project you're going to be doing and how it will be defined, and I talked about vendors who would come out and give you input. Maybe a plumbing contractor came out to do some work on an isolated section of piping in a unit that was leaking and found that you had a really bad corrosion problem. You know, those guys are up against it too because, you know, they look like they're trying to sell you extra work. And what an independent third-party consultant can do is help you understand what the scope of the project is, define it in a clear manner with drawings and specifications so that you can get competitive bids. That's really one of the cornerstones of why you would bring an engineer involved or get an architect or an engineer involved. If you're doing a repair that's less than $5,000 or $10,000, it wouldn't make sense to do that because you're going to spend significantly more money unless it's something that's a generic defect without everywhere in the association. You're just not going to get a value out of bringing a consultant in unless it's something you just can't figure out. That's a lot of why you would use a consultant as well. People call us and they say, you know, our roof has been leaking every winter for the last 3 years. We think we need to replace our roof. And guess what? They had just replaced the roof a few years ago. And we go out and we look at the construction and we find out it's not really the shingles on the roof at all. It's a condensation problem in the attic, a ventilation issue, or an insulation problem, or the dryer's venting into the attic. I mean, those are the kinds of scenarios that a technical person can help you evaluate and understand. I can tell you that on more than one occasion we go out and we look at associations that have gone through a major window replacement project because owners have complained about window leakage or patio door leakage. And we find out it's not related to the windows or the patio doors at all. It's the balcony above or the wall or some other element. And that may be, you know, another reason why you would bring in a consultant, whether it's an architect or an engineer.
But before you do bring in that engineer, your board needs to understand, once you find out the problem, and once you find out what's going on, you may have a duty to act. I know there have been many times Mark and I have been involved in working with associations and he's come in on a particular issue and then he tells us something different. And now my board has knowledge of it, and in order to ensure that they meet their fiduciary obligations, we can't just brush it under the rug, and it's something we need to address. So I always recommend that you remind your board, okay, we're gonna bring the engineer in, he's going to look at this, he's gonna evaluate it. Are you ready in case something else is discovered that we might have to expand the scope of our project, or we might actually be putting this project aside to now deal with something else more imminent that he determines needs to be addressed.
That's an excellent point. And why I always encourage people to, you know, talk to several different consultants, make sure you've done your homework in finding someone who's got experience in doing the kind of work you think you might need to have done. Because if a consultant goes out and says, you've got a major facade problem and we have to remove the brick on the outside of your building 6 stories up, and you weren't planning for that, and oh, by the way, we've got to notify the city of Chicago within 24 hours, you know, you want to make sure that the guy that's telling you that has got the credibility, the street cred to do that. I can't believe I just said that. Just how if I am. Another reason that you would engage perhaps an architect or an engineer to be involved in a project is to provide the ongoing oversight while the project is underway, so that you have someone knowledgeable of what's supposed to be done is actually being done in the field. What happens several times, or on multiple occasions for work that we've been engaged to help out with, is an association will start a project and they get into it and find out that, man, we are spending double the amount that we thought because we didn't recognize all these change orders that were going to come in. Well, it's nice to have a technical person there who can vet the work that the additional work that the contractor's finding that needs to be done, to give you the peace of mind that yes, that's something that needs to be done. That being said, if you've had a consultant help you do a project and you spend more than 20% on change orders, perhaps they didn't do the job they thought they were going to do. Now there's exceptions to every rule, but the hope is that, you know, when you have somebody come in and do an evaluation on the front end of a project to understand what the scope is. For example, if you're doing a facade project at the top of a building with parapet wall, there's probably going to be roofing involved there, but does it go beyond the 3-foot edge of the roof, or does it involve doing much more than that? And by the way, when you take the roof deck or the roof system off, what happens if you find rotted plywood and so on and so forth? Scope creep is a huge issue, and that's why, another reason why perhaps you have a consultant help you do that. Maybe they do some investigative openings. We did a erosion project for a client who had a parking garage with a terrace above, and the work that we did on the front end helped us to identify that we needed to use a cathodic protection program to minimize the amount of damage that would happen long term to the building to prevent the corrosion of the reinforcing steel.
How would you decide whether you need an architect or an engineer on a project?
I think you would look at their background. There are architects who specialize, forensic architects who specialize in doing work. Did everybody hear the question? How do you know whether you pick an architect or an engineer? Which is a great question, by the way. In Illinois, the state of Illinois, there's what's called the Structural Work Act. An architect's seal and a structural engineer's seal carry the same weight. The code of ethics for both of us stipulate that you're not allowed to practice outside of your area of expertise. So if you come to me and say, hey Mark, we want to redesign the outside of our buildings, we want to change the look and feel of our association, I tell you to go find an architect. Although we have architects on staff now, but I'm colorblind and I can barely find socks that match, so you don't want me picking out colors for your shutters and redoing your siding on your building. I'm the guy who wants to help you figure out why the walls are leaking and whether you need to replace the windows and what elements would be good so that you're meeting code requirements for structural repairs and building envelope issues. But if you're doing interior design work, things like that, again, structural engineers can do that stuff, but that's an area that they practice and are comfortable with. But clearly there are areas where architects who specialize in look, feel, that kind of thing would be a better application. And I hope that answers your question. Anybody else have input on that? Okay, so there's a slide here that talks about the how the engineer and the property manager, the roles that they play. And I think this is a point that Michelle already wisely made, and Gabby seconded it, is you need everybody involved in this whole thing, but clearly from where I stand, my understanding is that helping to set expectations are really important, and that is where the property manager plays a critical role in keeping things moving and keeping owners and board members informed. We love it when board members are there asking questions. They're part of the pre-bid walk with us. They're part of the decision making on material selection and things like that. But it's not an adversarial role. We're not competing with anybody when we're out there. As a consultant, like I said, we try to be smart about what we're looking at. Usually by the time someone calls an architect or an engineer, they already have the plumber, the roofer, the baker, the candlestick maker, whoever else out there to try and fix the thing. And there's usually like a 10-pound glob of caulk on something. But we're part of a team. So we need to take input from the manager, from the owners, from the board of directors, and obviously the team includes the finance people as well, and the attorney. So you need to build that team early on. I think if I would make one clear point to all of you today. If you're gonna do a capital project, you just have to plan ahead. And by ahead, I mean more than a month, more than 3 months. Sometimes it takes a year to get all of this planning done. So you need to be thinking ahead when you do this. But the role of the engineer really is to keep the manager informed. We disseminate all of our information to the manager because they want to be the point of contact for getting that stuff back to the board of directors. It just makes everything a lot cleaner. We can include people on the distribution list for field reports or emails, but the manager is the key link for us.
I think, yes, when Mark and I, we've done projects in the past before, and it's nice to have the one point of contact. The manager's pretty much the one that will gather all the information, get the daily updates, and kind of work very closely with the engineer to make sure that we have all the documents, we get all the site inspections, and we usually work with them to be the gatherers of all the information and to make sure that we're the one person disseminating the information. You don't want 5 different go-to people on the project, because then the information isn't getting disseminated evenly, and one person's going to say one thing, another person's going to say another thing. So you want to make sure you determine early on who's going to be that point of contact that's going to give the information to the board. And you want to be able to meet regularly with your engineer or any of the vendors or anyone else that's involved in the project. But typically that's what happens, and I gather all the information and then make sure that you're providing the updates on a regular basis to whether it's the homeowners, your board members, whether it's the attorney that has to review something, the bank that's loaning you the money. But typically, yes, it's cohesive. When you have a cohesive agreement with your engineer and everyone knows what their role is, it ends up going a lot smoother.
So the last thing I wanted to touch on briefly before I turn this over to Gabriella is the bidding process. And we talked about it a little bit already in terms of how you build this list of folks who are going to bid on the project. And scope has a lot to do with it. If it's a roofing project, a paving project, a riser replacement project, you may have multiple contractors involved. You may need to have a general contractor. You may just have one brick mason. It depends on the scope of work of the project. Ultimately, the specifications, the documents will define who's going to be involved. If you're doing a flat roof replacement project with HVAC equipment on the roof, you need to make sure that the general contractor, the roofing contractor, if that's who it is, has subs that are licensed electricians and HVAC professionals, that they're going to be moving stuff around up there. Those are all defined within the context of the project specifications and drawings. Those are things that get delineated in those documents. But in terms of the process itself, once the documents are prepared, the list of contractors is compiled. There's what's called a pre-bid meeting that's done on site. Sometimes it's done collectively where everybody's invited all at one time so that all the contractors can hear the same thing that the engineer is talking about in terms of showing them where you're going to get access to the roof or the boiler room or whatever element it is that you're working on. Everybody gets to be there all at one time. That's a process, I think, that generally works pretty well. And I'll be honest with you, the dynamic of it is that the contractors get to see who all they're competing against, and there's oftentimes questions that get flushed out at the time of the pre-bid meeting where the engineer's got to make an addenda to the project. It may be the one contractor had an idea about how to attach the handrail for a balcony repair project to the siding without having to remove all of the siding. And that's an addenda that can be created to the documents and hopefully save the association money. The bids are usually returned sealed to the engineer or the property manager, and then a vetting process is done where the consultant will provide technical review. We do not, as a general rule, and I think my competitors would agree with me, engineers do not pick the contractor. We'll name 2 or 3 folks that we think are very qualified. Their bid is very competitive, and we want them to talk to the board of directors and obviously have the board develop the sense of comfort because they're going to be part of the team. So that's really where the bidding process for the consultant ends. And then once a contractor is selected, we move on to the preparation of contract documents. Actually, we've got a slide about how to pay, and so I'm going to, Michelle, you want to handle that?
Sure.
Okay.
Hey, Mark, before you leave the session,
Yes, sir.
do you want to comment at all? There's one thing you kind of briefed over your roles and scope. Do you usually jot costs out
to kind of help give an idea of where everybody should be, which also helps pre-identify any potential contingencies, which in the early development stages before we probably get into the final budgeting section. You want to touch on any of that?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. That's an excellent question. There's often, you know, everything we do, it doesn't get done without money, right? So knowing and trying to understand and control or quantify the cost of a project is of paramount importance to the boards and to the managers, everybody involved in the project, for that matter. And engineers can provide engineering estimates of cost, and that's something we're routinely asked to do. We're often asked to give that estimate of the cushion. For example, if you're doing a riser replacement project, a plumbing project, and you want to just do the horizontal lines in a hallway first. Well, if you're going to put shutoff valves in before they go into the unit space, but you get to the unit space and you find out that the piping, the lateral line that's running into the unit's all corroded, how do you handle that? What do you anticipate the additional costs might be if you run into that situation? And how well defined, how much exploratory work did you do to understand that? Those are questions that I think are fair to ask your consultant, and they're typically willing to provide that as part of their documents and give you an estimate. You know, whether it's going to be we're doing 100% replacement, so there's no chance of having to, for example, do a roof replacement project and need to do roof decking if all of the decking was identified as being bad from the outset. You know what I mean? So it really goes to the level of detail that you spend on the front end. It's so hard sometimes, as I think Michelle already said, to have associations engage an engineer. We did a driveway replacement project a couple of years ago, and they had, I think, 93 driveways, and they were having drainage issues on the property. We knew that we were going to do some core testing before we started the project, identify how thick the pavement is, what kind of subbase they had under the driveways, but it didn't make sense to core every driveway. They could have spent $80,000 doing all of this upfront coring engineering work to identify problems, but it just didn't make sense because the total value of that work wasn't important based on the fact that we did a half dozen cores and found the exact same conditions everywhere. So, I mean, it really is a function of how much work you do on the front end in terms of the contingency piece and the risk averseness of the association, I guess, in terms of identifying what the contingency should be. I'm not sure I answered your question directly now that I'm thinking about it. But
the turning point usually, potentially my experience with capital projects is when you get the contingency line item, right away the first reaction of the board is somebody did something wrong, you missed something.
Right.
If you don't have this pre-identified, that if you don't have them coached up and you're not already planning on a contingency, because I don't think that capital project that hasn't used something.
Yeah.
The first impression is somebody did something wrong. Now you got to get past that. And if you've already had this dialogue that was difficult to involve the whole team, like you should, this is the turning point. This will either make you or break you.
Yeah, the fact that you're going to find an unforeseen condition is guaranteed. You go with plan A, but plan B is usually what gets executed. And I can tell you, nobody can write an airtight specification. And if they tell you that they can, they're telling you a story. So, okay, turn it over to Michelle.
pay for the project. Obviously, if you know the project is coming up, you can go ahead and budget for it. We're always gonna make sure that we follow the guidelines of, hopefully you have some previous or prior bids that you can get a general idea of where you're at, as well as speak with the engineer and make sure that you have the right contingency amount. Because as we stated, it never goes as planned. You can talk about doing a special assessment, whether it's a one-time special assessment to the homeowners or over several months or several years. You can look into your reserves. Your reserves would include any of your money market accounts, your CDs, maybe you have extra money in your operating account. You can always contact your bank or get a loan from a third party. You can use a combination of all of these items. How many people here had to do a special assessment to pay for their capital project? So that's not that many. How many people, association, had put enough money away in the reserves so that they could afford the capital project? That's very good as well. So it's just very important that you look at the aspect when it's not an emergency or a code violation. Hopefully you have enough time to be able to put it in your budget so that you can put in the appropriate amounts. But make sure when you're doing your budget, and it is one of those larger capital projects, aside from the line item that you're saying just for the project itself, you need to make sure that you're taking care of any city or permit fees, engineering fees. A lot of people plan to budget for the project itself, but don't take all the other factors into consideration. Also, you're going to want to make sure that you check your declaration to make sure anything you're doing in relating to the special assessment or pulling your money out of your reserves or any investments that you have are along those guidelines. And Gabby's going to talk a little bit more on those. And we're going to move into the contract, who's going to draft the contract, and I'm going to turn it over to Gabby.
Before we go to that, the only thing I want to say about paying for the project, one thing you have to keep in mind is so often you're, like we said, you're going through the project and you realize there's other things that need to be done. And there may be areas of the limited common areas. And Mark and I have had experience with this before too, that we're making repairs to the common elements, we're making repairs to the limited common elements. And so when that is part of your project, you need to also take a step back and look, is there a portion of our expenses that should be assessed back to the owners? And how are we assessing it back to the owners? So again, to Michelle's point, you may be finding quite a few, it's a combination of resources to pay for this, and some of them, it can get very tricky. So it's you want to have that discussion in advance. And that's why, before we get to the contract, it's at that point, once you've put together your team, once you've defined the scope, once you've figured out how you're going to pay for it, that's a really great time to sit down with your owners and have a meeting. It's not always the most pleasant meeting, and I've been at meetings like this with some of you in this room, where everyone, you bring your whole team together, and literally each team member explains their role, explains what's going to happen, and you give the owners an overview. And this is another great way to get owner involvement, because if we're going to be asking them for a special assessment, they do have the right to know exactly what's involved and to show them that you've done your due diligence and that you're making this as cost effective as possible while also meeting any needs of the municipality or making sure we take care of our property values. So I think it's a really good time before we get into the contract to have that sit down meeting with the owners. Let them vent. Let them ask their questions. Don't just throw yourself into it as managers, and don't just throw the board into it. Let us come and answer those questions for the owners. And again, what that is doing, it's showing the community that the board is exercising their right, but also completing their due diligence. I would also say if you're getting a loan from a third party, have the lender there as well, because the lender can help explain to them not only the underlying loan that the association is going to be obtaining, but maybe there's some other options that the lender can be explaining to the group as a whole too.
And I just wanted to add, as Gabby stated, and I talked about town hall meetings and board meetings, I always find it helpful if not only you're doing one prior to the project starting, it's always a good idea to try and do one midway through the project to keep the owners abreast of what's going on so that they're not left in the dark, give them a timeline of where you're at. And then it's always a good idea to do it at the end of the project as well and have either the engineer there or the key people there so that you can wrap up and explain to them if there's any type of warranty or how, moving forward, if they have any questions or concerns, how those can be addressed.
So now we've figured out who's gonna do the work, we figured out the scope of the project. What do we do now? This is where I come involved, and this is, to me, the most important ingredient. The contract, of course.
The attorneys do the most important person.
So, who should draft the contract? The contractor. The contractor is to give me something to work with. I cannot tell you how many times I have seen a proposal with just a dollar amount, balcony work. And this just happened not even a month ago, where the manager came to me and said, oh, we need you to review the contract. I kid you not, it was an invoice. And it was just, here's what the contractor gave me. I said, go back to the contractor and tell him to give me a real contract. And yes, I could have drafted a contract, but the contractor needs to be saying, this is what I'm going to do for you. Don't be shy. Go to the contractor and say, give me a contract. And I can't tell you how many times people have said to me, don't you have a template? No, I don't have a template. There is no such thing as just having a template contract. So you start with the contractor giving you the contract, and then yes, I heard somebody say the attorney, bring it to me. I can't tell you how many times contracts don't get reviewed by the attorney. And I'm not going to kid myself into thinking every contract you have your board execute, I've reviewed, or somebody else, attorney has. I get it. Not-for-profit corporations have a budget. There's not a need for every single contract. But the type of projects we're talking about today, you need to have them reviewed. You need to make sure that protects you, that protects the board, that protects the community as a whole. It will be cheaper to have me review the contract before you execute it than once there's a problem to get me involved. There are many times where there will be an AIA contract, and then sometimes you don't use an AIA contract. AIA contracts, Mark, you probably have a stronger opinion on it than I do. You know, they're very, very common with these types of capital projects. They're great. They're a form contract which is generated by the American Institute of Architects. It covers more than you will ever probably encounter with the project. But it's drafted by people who have had a lot of experience and really want to make sure that everybody knows what you're supposed to do, what you're not supposed to do, what your obligations are. In my experience with some associations, it's very difficult to live by an AIA contract.
There's just they're time tested. There's a family of those documents that include the contract, pay application, change order documents that we find to be very helpful because everything is almost like a recipe, which is interesting because that's what we're talking about, recipes today. But there's cookbook fill-in spots that have to be annotated in those documents.
And I think Mark makes a great point, and that's why I skipped us to the next slide, because so often I look at like the one contract, the standard agreement, and I'm like, okay, but there's like several other counterparts to this. And the manager never even saw that. The manager never even saw that. So it's really important, to Mark's point, that you understand if you're going to have an AIA contract, it's not going to be one form. Within that document, it refers to all the different contracts that are incorporated within it, and we need to look at all those, and we need to make the necessary changes to those, which there are necessary changes for these types of deals as well. Even if it's an AIA contract, you do want an attorney to review it because, like I said, there can be terms in there that are very challenging for some associations, and we want to make sure it's addressed. Just going back to the original slide, the time to get the attorney involved is when the contract is in your hands. But before you even get it to me, if you want to, you can take a look through the contract just to make sure those key terms are there so that you're sure that you're getting all of the ducks in a row before it's coming to me. And there's, like I said, no template, but there are terms that are very important to make sure are in every contract. We want to identify who are the parties to our contract. I'll tell you right off the bat, one of the first things I do is when I see you're getting into a contract with a corporation, I look to see are they incorporated. I look to see if they've been in lawsuits. I try to get a little bit of a feel for who these contractors are. I think it's very important for the association to have an idea, and that's something you could do ahead of time too. If you've worked with the party, I'd like to know that, because that gives me an idea of who we're working with. Not because I'm going to do everything to make sure that we stick with that contract, but there might be terms in there that I find troublesome, that if I know you have a working relationship with this vendor, I can talk to you about it. We've talked about the scope of work, but the only thing I will say as it relates to the contract, you have to make sure, like Mark was saying, usually there's a separate bidding process, there's a separate document that identifies the scope. You need to make sure that's incorporated within the contract. So many times I see a contract and it'll say balcony replacement. Okay, what are we gonna do? I don't know, so I need to make sure I incorporate Mark's scope of work within that contract. So it's really important to give that to the attorney as well, so that I'm sure that I'm including language that'll cover us on the type of work. Compensation, since nobody works for free, we do need to make sure that that's addressed. The one thing that I find most helpful on my end is, I don't know, like Mark will know or Michelle will know if this is too competitive of a bid or not, if it's on the low end or the high end. But what I do know is, are you giving too much money up front? Are you not holding back enough to the end? I can think of a situation we had, and I don't think anyone in the room was involved with it, where the contract was executed by the association. We didn't review it, and the contract provided for, I believe it was 50% of the contract price to be paid up front. And the association did it, and the vendor couldn't get a permit. And so, vendor couldn't do the work, vendor took off. Has 50% of the project, or the cost of the project in their hands. That's a great example of you cannot give too much up front. I will often say and try to educate myself in finding out what's a realistic dollar amount that this vendor needs to go get the materials. I don't want you to give up any money up front, right? But that's not realistic. The vendor has to go pay for materials. So that's another great thing. It's why I will be in contact with Mark as well, or whoever you have on your team, to try to get a feel for that. Warranty language is very, very important in the contract, and it's going to vary. Every project is different, every vendor is different. The scope of the warranty is going to be different, but we just want to make sure everyone has an understanding and it's clear what's going to be in there. Indemnification is huge, huge, huge. You are in the driver's seat. You want to make sure that your association is covered for any damage that is caused either to a person or to the property by the vendor. And I can't tell you how many times this can be a sticking point, and associations will say to me, oh, we're okay. We know this guy's good. You might be absolutely right, but you are the customer, and more importantly, the liability to the rest of your community, if you don't include the indemnification language, could be very expensive and great. And that's something we really want to make sure that is in there. We want to make sure the association is going to be fully indemnified, and we usually include the agent, because the managing agent is the one who's out there, as Michelle was explaining, dealing with the day-to-day. We want to make sure the agent is covered too. Insurance and license and permits, that's pretty self-explanatory. We obviously, I know you probably have seen it, that contractors come on who aren't insured. That's obviously problematic. So we want to see that insurance and know that they have that up front before we get into the issue. Termination provisions are very, very important. There can be a misconception that, well, there's no language in there, so that's great for us. Not necessarily, because we also want to protect ourselves and we want to keep the vendor from just walking without any notice to us. That's another thing that I will take into consideration and perhaps talk to management and perhaps talk to the vendor. Realistically, if I needed to get a new contractor, how much time would we need? Is 7 days notice sufficient, or do I need 14 days notice? We try to get an idea that way, because I'm always thinking worst case scenario. I'm always thinking it's going to go wrong. You want me to think that, so that when it goes wrong, as much as possible is covered in this contract. And along those same lines, I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody come to me and say, they breached. Okay, where does the contract define what they did wrong to rise to the level of being a default or a breach? And there's no language in there. You want to make sure you explain what is a default. Clearly not paying under the contract is a default, but it's a little bit more challenging when it comes on the vendor side. Was it a default if the vendor couldn't get a permit? Not necessarily if that's going to be the association's responsibility to work with their engineer. So you want to make sure you define what the vendor cannot do to rise to the level of default. It's a checks and balance. It makes sure we all are doing the right things. And if we think about this in advance, we're going to protect not only the association, but ourselves. And along those lines, one thing that we don't have on here, I'd love to know, how many of you have signed the contract instead of a board member? Oh, come on. You don't have to read. All right, thank you for being honest. It's okay, but don't sign the contract. I will tell you, I feel for the managers who do have to sign the contract, and I'm sure your board is saying, just get it signed, we need to get them here. You know what? That's not right for the board to be doing that. And it's likely not, what we want to do is make it crystal clear who are the parties, like we said early on, but those parties are the ones then to sign. If your board comes to you and says, please sign the contract, one, if you don't feel comfortable in saying don't feel the contract, simple way out. Let's ask Gabby. Let's ask the attorney if I should do that. I feel very confident that most of my competitors as well will say the same thing. Management should not sign the contract. Are you exposing yourself to liability? Maybe, maybe not. But you know why you want the board to sign, in my opinion? I want them to look at that contract. I want them to read it. Because back to Michelle's early point, of everybody being a part of this process, they need to be a part of the process and understanding who's doing what. And to Mark's point, it's a great way to manage expectations. Make sure your board members see that contract and sign it. Yes?
Look back to the previous slide for 2 seconds.
This one?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
That's good.
Okay.
You didn't cover time period.
So I think, I certainly will, the time period. I like for contracts to have a start time. Now, I know it's not always realistic since we live in the Chicagoland area and some of it so much is dependent on weather, but this is a great way to manage expectations as well with the time period. When are you going to get out there and start this project? When are you going to finish this project? It doesn't mean we can't change it, but it helps to give an incentive for everybody to keep moving it ahead. I think it also is a great message to send to your owners. We have a start date, and this is our proposed end date. And it allows people, like Mark said, we're talking about their homes, and sometimes we're going into their units, and sometimes we're going to their balconies or saying, you can't use your balcony. Let them know we're trying to minimize the disruption to you as much as we can. And so if we can put a time frame, you should have that there. At least have when it's going to start and approximately when it'll be completed. And if I'm not mistaken, Mark, even the AIA contract will have language in there as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's very, very important to have that there. So once you have the contract and once you have it signed, it's going to be at that point we can start living and we can start going through the project and completing the day-to-day process of it. And at this point, I'm going to let Mark and Michelle kind of get a little bit of their input of what the day-to-day project management is like.
Mark, I want to be in charge, just you know.
The managers are always in charge. In fact, when I was invited to speak at this, I was flattered to be part of the Spice Girl team. So this recipe process, and you know, when when I asked them what I was supposed to do, they said, whatever we tell you to do. So that was a monster. I thought it was obvious, frankly. But in terms of the day-to-day piece, the work that gets done, what we tell associations all the time is the contractor is responsible for means and methods. The architect engineer does not direct contractors or their employees directly. That's the responsibility of the contractor. And all of the issues with regard to schedule, which is important, and depending upon the size of the contract and how, for example, if you have 52 buildings that are going to get re-roofed, they didn't all get built in the same year, so they're probably not all going to get re-roofed in the same year. And there's usually a Gantt chart or some sort of project management scheduling piece that's put together on the front end that gets asked for either as part of the specification or at the time the contract is signed. But the day-to-day field supervision of the work is done by the contractor, depending upon how the architect or engineer is engaged. They may be out there every day. They may be out there at a critical milestone. If you're pouring concrete, they have to check the formwork before the concrete's placed, or they have to inspect the ice and water shield on a roof system before it's completed, or some other element gets buried in the roof system. But the management of that is worked out on the front end of the project. What we tell associations all the time, and in an effort to try and make sure we are very useful, very resourceful with the use of the association's money, is to find a good contractor, write a good specification, find a good contractor, and then check in with them. And it's usually on these projects how you start that's most critical. So if you're going to have a consultant help you, you want them involved on the front end. They always say it's not how you start, it's how you finish. But on these kind of projects, you don't want to get off on the wrong foot and get 3 months down the road and find out that, oh, well, that's not how I interpreted the drawings and plans and specifications, and now we've got to go back into the attics and redo something that's going to put a lot of additional stress on the manager or the owners and so on and so forth.
And Mark, I can just add, it's important before you start this process and you're determining who is in charge and who's got what responsibilities, that you talk with your engineer and your vendor ahead of time and find out what times and dates throughout the project or throughout the week that you're going to meet with them, when you're going to get the field reports, when you're going to get the status reports. So you have an opportunity to get those, review those, discuss them with your board members so that they're kept in the loop, and then find out, give yourself an opportunity and enough time to review all the materials, and then go back to the engineer or the project manager or the vendor, whoever is in charge at that point, to discuss whether there's a change order that's necessary or what the next step is, and make sure along the ways that everyone is on the same page. And feel free as a manager to be doing your own inspections as well, and if you have questions, it's always good to ask them, because it's a learning process for you as well, because like I said earlier, we're not experts in every field, but for every capital project you do, you're going to pick up something new that you didn't know before that's going to be helpful moving forward.
Thank you. And I had a point and I just lost it. The communication is key, and I would urge all of you, whoever you hire as a consultant, to ask them to have bi-monthly meetings on site with the contractor, so that the property manager and board member, if there's somebody assigned from the board, can attend. It just keeps the communication open and clear, especially at the start of the project. If you find that after 2 months of that, everything is running swimmingly, there's no major hiccups or glitches, you can do away with it. And I'm not somebody who likes meetings. I hate meetings. But this is just a way to make sure that everybody stays informed, especially the board and property manager. And if there is a problem, people are held accountable. And meeting every 2 weeks is a great way to do that. It only has to be an hour long. Go over the primary issues and you're done.
The other thing I want to add to that is, as you're figuring out who's going to do what, it's it's very important that the board takes the proper steps in delegating authority that might be necessary. So for example, we talked about somebody who's involved on the day-to-day issues. Well, Mark was explaining that you're gonna probably see change orders. So who's making those decisions about those change orders? We don't wanna have to have a board meeting every time that there's a change order if it's within the scope of what we've contemplated. So I always recommend to the board at the time that they're voting to execute the contract, at that meeting is a good time to have the discussion of who does the manager go to when the change order comes through. And you identify a board member, you identify the extent of that board member's ability or authority to execute a change order. I usually will say 2 board members. I will also like to see it up to a certain dollar amount, as long as it's within the scope of the contract, perhaps even a change or an expectancy that Mark contemplated. You create a little box, and those board members then stay within that box, but then it allows the contract to keep moving. You also want to define and delegate the authority of the property manager as it relates to the project. Are they authorized to talk to the vendor? Is there anybody else authorized to talk to the vendor? What is the extent that the manager can give direction or access to other areas within the property? And often people will say, well, that's in the management agreement. It needs to also be in your minutes. It needs to be a properly delegated authority. You don't want me to bring up home, but I have to bring up home. And this is why. If you don't properly delegate, show that the delegation of authority was granted to you, whether it's you as a board member or you as a manager, and problems come up later, we're going to be kicking ourselves. It's a very simple process. It's just making some motions, and it's making sure the project keeps continuing to move on very smoothly.
Thanks, Gabby. So normally there is a threshold level that's established at the time you do the pre-construction meeting. If you're doing a roofing project, for example, maybe a nominal number of sheets of plywood are acceptable to be replaced as part of the contract, and that would be vetted at the beginning of the project. So the only last point I guess I didn't touch on is who manages the engineer, and let's be honest, nobody can manage that. No, we report to the board of directors, obviously, but that usually is done through the property manager as well. So we're checking in with them. When an engineer is out to do site inspection work, they're submitting field reports, and again, you want to work that out ahead of time to make sure you're going to get a report 24 hours after a site inspection is done. I mean, that's really the only way some of this oversight work is helpful, because if you wait 3 weeks to solve a problem that's getting buried the next day, it does no good. So just keep that in mind. Okay, moving right on, we're going to talk about communication. I'm going to turn that over to Michelle.
Okay, most of the items up here, I think we've already kind of gone over, but as you know, communication is always key with the homeowners. Again, I can't reiterate enough to have as much communication before, during, and after the project to make sure they know who they can come to, who they can ask questions, because you know you don't want to keep getting numerous phone calls to your customer service or to you, or them stopping any of the vendors and asking them to do this at their house or make sure theirs is done this way. Or a lot of times they're saying something isn't being done right when that section or that portion isn't being done, or maybe that part of the crew is working on a different part of the building and they're going to get back to it. So make sure you're having your meetings, whether they're just informational meetings, make sure you're giving enough notice so the owners know about it. Give them the full timeline so they know what the expectation is, how long it's going to start. If it's a phased capital project, make sure you let them know that these buildings are getting done this year and these buildings are getting done next year. I talked about the meet and greet. Explain what the homeowner responsibilities are. As Gabby spoke earlier, whether someone is getting charged back to them, whether they need to remove items from their balcony or their patios, or keep their cars off of the driveway for so long, keep their lights on, whatever it is, make sure you clearly explain it. It will really help in the long run. And obviously, the last item on here, how to report concerns. Make sure that that information is sent out regularly so that they can report in, and you can also log all the information. Because when you do have your meetings, especially at the closure of the project, there's always something that comes up afterward, whether people just weren't around during the initial phase and didn't hear what you said, or didn't hear what the total scope is, or they claim something was damaged as a result of the project. Make sure that you're logging all of that so you have a record of everything, so you can address it with, whether it's the engineer, the vendor, as well as keep the board advised of everything that's going on. I'm going to turn it over to Gab. We're going to go over one more thing, and then we'll open it up to some questions and answers as well.
The one thing I would recommend is you're communicating with your owners. If you're representing to them, that you're going to communicate to them so often or in a certain manner, follow it. That's probably one of the biggest mistakes a board can make, is they can go into that informational meeting saying, we will give you regular updates, we will give you, weekly updates, and then not to provide it with them. Even if it's just, there's no change, let them know. Again, taking on a project like this is such a great way of really sending a great message to your association. And if you do it right, you're gonna send that great message. And when you don't, that's when you're going to create problems for your association. You're never going to make everybody happy. But what you want to do is you want to send out the message of credibility and due diligence. And so, it's going to go sour sometimes. And sometimes there's nothing you can do to prevent it, but sometimes there are things that you can do to avoid making a sour project or creating a sour project. These are some of the items which I think are very self-explanatory, and from when we were all discussing it, we kind of went through our years of experience of what were the things that made it really go bad? What were the things that really were within our control? Some of it isn't within our control. But these are the factors that we believe really are within an association's control through the board and the management, that if you can try to do the best you can to avoid using these ingredients, I think you will find at the end of the day your project was a success. And we keep hammering home the communication. Well, if you think about it, most of this here relates back to making sure there's good communication. So what is the most important ingredient? Well, I gave mine away early on as to what I think is the most important ingredient. What do you guys think? What do you guys think, from a manager's perspective, is the most important ingredient? Communication. What was it? Communication. What do you think, Michelle?
I'm going to go with communication.
Mark?
Absolutely.
I think communication is very important, but again, from my perspective, the contract is so important. Probably, I would put it I don't want to say you're all right that communication is critical, and that's with everybody, but the contract to me is where I think that too often terms are missed or not addressed, and that can create bigger, larger problems for an association.
And I think that's part of the communication.
Yeah,
right? I mean,
that's a good
just
point.
like the contract documents, the drawings and specifications are part of how we communicate what needs to be done. And it is amazing that we can still spend a lot of time developing these plans and specifications and really be very specific about the exact coatings we want on balconies and things of that nature, and they still can be misinterpreted.
Sure.
It's,
And I think to Mark's point, that's why there isn't just one main ingredient. When you put this all together, there's several very, very important ingredients. Okay, so, do you have any questions? Yes? He's going to come around with it. The one thing I want to add is Mike's walking around. I think one thing is I look at contracts, I try to take the experiences that we've had with other associations and bring that within the contracts that I'm reviewing, whether it's to avoid a problem or where I thought, wow, this really worked well for an association. Let's make sure that's in the contract too. And that's another benefit of having these contracts reviewed, is you can learn from either somebody else's mistakes or also from somebody else's successes. Yes?
Okay, two very brief comments and then a question. The first one is permits. I don't think you can overemphasize the need. You know, a lot of projects that if you're not involving an engineer, maybe small projects, you think your contractor will say, oh, you don't need a permit for that, get permits. They're essential, and make sure you know who is responsible for getting that permit, if it's the contractor or, you know, that type of thing. So that's
Well, and
just
along
one.
those lines, is the permit fee part of your contract?
Right.
Now, I can't tell you how many times that I've gone back and said, okay, here's the compensation, just keep in mind, you're also gonna have a permit fee. Oh, no, we're not. Oh, yes, you will, because look at paragraph 15. That was never discussed in advance. So you wanna make sure that that's cleared out. Thank you for reminding us of that.
The other comment is with regard to special assessments, and this ties into what all of you referenced before. Plan a minimum of 6 months, start to finish, for the special assessment process. So you can't wait until you have the project teed up, ready to go, and then think you're going to get a special assessment passed. There's several steps involved in that, and you know, we're finding our experiences that takes typically about that much time.
And keep in mind, there might be times where you don't have the option of waiting 6 months. So if you can't, there's provisions under the Condo Act, and even in CEQA, that allows you to adopt special assessments in emergency situations without having to deal with owner challenges. But to your point, when you are adopting a special assessment, it's also a good idea, especially if you have an older declaration, to seek the guidance of your attorney and how you're adopting that. Some of these older declarations will provide that you need unit owner approval. Even though the Condo Act and CEQA have language to the contrary, the advantage of having the attorney saying, even in an email, no, it does not need owner approval, oh, as long as you stay under this percentage, you're not subject to a challenge, is that owner who then comes back and says, well, here in section 4H it says you need to get our approval. That makes you look like you're trying to pull a fast one. Whereas if you can just say, there's a special assessment, our declaration provides for this, but our attorney has already told us we don't need unit owner approval because of these provisions in the contract. Again, it's showing due diligence, it's showing that you have credibility.
Okay, and here's my question. Disclosure. At what point in this whole process do these projects need to be reported on the 22.1s, or, you know, at what point
It's a great
these have to be added?
So you always want to err on the side with 22.1s and just give as much disclosure as you can. And, you know, the 22.1 is going to require the board to disclose those capital expenditures that are anticipated within the 2 fiscal years. So not just our year, but 2 years after that. The problem when you don't disclose it or disclose a potential special assessment is collecting on it later. My advice is when the discussions are really starting to go about special assessments, disclose it. And when you're really starting to investigate the project, you should be disclosing it. The reason is err on this side of caution. You don't want to be in a situation, and I have one right now that's going on where it was not disclosed, and the owner came in and now was saying, I should not be subject to the special assessment that you now are adopting because nobody told me this capital expenditure was being considered. And they were right. Now, there are other factors involved that kind of give reason as to why it wasn't disclosed in advance, but you don't want to create the gray area where you can't collect all the money. So my advice is when it's starting to show up in the minutes and it's starting to show up in the board agenda, it should be now on the 22.1.
I had a question, or 2 things. A waiver of lien on a contract, is that part of it also then?
Right, so typically in the AIA contract, it'll provide, when Mark's getting the payment request, that there has to be the lien waivers that are signed as well.
Right, and a partial waiver for partial payments, so yes, absolutely, that's part of the review process. You want to make sure that you have those waivers in place every time you get a pay application.
And if it's a non-AIA contract, that's a term that we're going to be looking for when we're looking at the